Hey everyone, this is Andrew. Do you want to make better music? Because I think everyone does. Even if you ask the most successful music producer in the world, they'll pretty much always tell you that they want to make better music. So in this video, I'm going to give you 5 simple music production tips that will help you make better music. But before we begin, I just want to say that I'm not going to be giving you the generic, like, make your mix clear, make your master better, write a catchy hook, because I think you all know that and you really want the nitty-gritty details. So tip number 1 is that you don't want everything to be perfect in your mix. If I click play, you'll hear this track. There's a couple different ways you can do this. In this track, the way I did it, it was on each of these serum layers. I put on a combination of saturation, vinyl distortion, I EQ'd things and boosted frequencies, cut other frequencies, and that just helped give it a more natural flair. It's not like so clinical. You don't want your music to sound like you're going to the doctor's office. You don't want like pure sine waves and pure oscillators and everything. And aside from adding distortion or other types of saturation methods, ways you can accomplish this would be, if you go in your effects, you can add distortion inside of Serum. You can add chorus to kind of spice things up. You can add multiple unison oscillators to add more dissonance. You can also do it with the composition of your music. Add dissonant notes or make some of the notes out of tune. Another way is, instead of just clicking with your mouse to program in sounds, actually perform them and leave the off-time differences in. Or you can add a swing factor. So that's just ways you can help make your music imperfect, which actually ends up sounding better in a lot of cases. So tip number 2 is actually related to tip number 1, and it's don't only use software synthesizers. So if you have a song that's just entirely made up out of Serum instances, it might sound kind of clinical. You know, it's good to mix up your sound sources, but in this particular tip, don't only use software sound sources. So in this case, I am actually using all software sound sources, but the thing is that the Mellotron is actually an emulation. It's a physical modeling algorithm of a acoustic or analog sound source. So it is software, but when I say don't use all software synthesizers, try to mix in sample libraries like from Contact, try to mix in physical modeling algorithms, or just turn on your mic and record some actual sound sources yourself. Because this, I'll play just the Mellotron by itself. But it's very organic sounding, and it contrasts, you know, the Serum patches, which are already, you know, they're nice, but they're not as organic sounding as the Mellotron. Oh, synthesizers are nice. You know, and this works on the other side too. If you're making a mostly acoustic song, it could also be cool to mix in some synthesizers. So it might not make sense for your genre, but if you're working on like a trailer music piece that's mostly orchestral, it might be cool to mix in some electronic synthesizers or analog synthesizers. But in general, if you're making an electronic song, especially if there's no like lead vocals, try to mix in some acoustics or analog sound sources to give some more organic and real sound to your song. Step number 3 is to make your instruments interact with each other. You don't want your song to sound like just a stack of all these different tracks. You want it to sound like one cohesive song and everything to gel together. So there's a couple different ways you can do that. And in this track, I'm only using, I think, one of them, or maybe 2. So if I look at this group here, this group actually contains everything aside from the drums. And so what I've done is I've sidechained everything to a sidechain track and the drums. So I wanted to have 2 different sources of sidechaining, so that's why I have these 2 things. But the idea here is that all of those synths and bass and even the vocal chops and the lead lines are pumping together at the same time. And that gives the effect that it's just like one wall of sound it's interacting with the drums. And on another level, if I look at my drum track here, I do have individual processing on each layer, or maybe not every layer, but on individual layers of the drums. But on the overall drum bus, or drum track, I have a glue compressor. And what that does is that, you know, you have your hi-hats, you have your snares, you have your kick drums, and those all have their own sounds, but you want your drums to sound like drums. You don't want it to sound like a bunch of layers of drums. So one way to do that is with a glue compressor. You can also, another example of this would be if you get all the synths in your tracks and you put them in their own group and then put like an EQ over all of them, put a compressor on all of them, get all your lead tracks, put them in one group, put a compressor and EQ on all of them. So the more you start to group things together and process them as a bundle, the more those elements will gel together. So if you do this all across your song, and then you're doing, of course, in your master bus where you're putting a compressor and EQ, limiting everything on your master bus, then these elements help contribute to your track sounding like a song that's, made to go together. So tip number 4 is to add ear candy using panning. And a lot of people listen to music on headphones, and there's an effect that I like to call ear candy, where you're listening on headphones and something in the track just goes like and when you're listening on speakers it sounds nice, but when you're listening on headphones it's really like, it almost gives you chills. So I call it ear candy, and it's a very easy way to just make your track kind of like instantly just be like, whoa, that sounds really cool. And I'll show you one instance of it on this track that I use, and it's actually on one of these synth layers. And I'll solo this and play it. And this is very subtle. Now there is another case in this Mellotron. What I did is, instead of using the auto panner, I used echo, and I put it on ping pong mode, so every echo just goes to alternate speakers. So I'll show you what that sounds like. If I put the wet all the way up so you can hear just the delay. So you can kind of hear it, oscillating back and forth. Sometimes I'll do this more extreme, sometimes I'll do this less, but you don't just have to use the auto panner and Ableton Live tools like Echo. There's a cool plugin. If I go into my plugins, type in Sound Toys, drop down, and then there's Mr. Panman, or just Panman. But it's the same thing, it's just this will work on any DAW that you happen to have. Another way you can do that is if you go, your timeline, and at least in Ableton, this is how you do it. You would click this automation thing, you go to your mixer, and then you go to panning, and you can actually just draw in automation curves to move things around. Sometimes you want things to constantly move around, and sometimes you just want like a very specific thing to happen, So it depends what you want to do, but those are at least your options. Now, before we go on to tip number 5, which is the most important tip, I think, I just want to let you know there is actually a tip number 6, a bonus tip that I didn't tell you about, so stick around for that after tip number 5. And what is tip number 5? Tip number 5 is to incorporate the human voice in any way. So if you're making a track that already has lead vocals, then this isn't really a problem. But if you're making a track that's instrumental, I would say that try as hard as you can to incorporate the human voice in the music, some way. So one way to do that is to actually use a vocal chop sample. And that's what I did in this track here. So it's very simple. If I play this segment, I'll unsolo it, and then I'll solo the vocal chop. And the reason for this is that humans kind of naturally gravitate towards human voices, as you can imagine. We've evolved to hear human voices. So if you have a track that's purely instrumental with no voices on it whatsoever, then it's just an extra reason for someone who doesn't like instrumental music to click off. If you have vocal chops and vocal sounds, then at least the people who don't like instrumental music will be more likely to like your song. And you can also use this even if you do have vocals in your track. For example, in one of the songs I put out recently, I'll put a link to it in the description, called Our Love. I made it so that as soon as, or pretty quickly after the intro happened, even though the verse started a little bit later, I had a vocal chop kind of kick in right away. And I do this in a lot of my songs. I did it in Burn, which I'll also link down below. And I did it in Red Light in some way. So, you want your vocals to kick in pretty fast, because that's like the hook. That's what a lot of people care about the most, is the vocals. So even if you have vocals, but especially if you're instrumental, try to incorporate vocals as quickly as possible, starting at the beginning of the song, for something for those people to grab onto. And then don't go more than like 30 seconds in your song without having any kind of vocal elements. Tip number 6, the bonus tip, is to get feedback from people. So I recommend getting feedback from 3 people before you release any of your songs. You don't have to do this with every song, but at least periodically do it. I would get feedback, 1 from someone, a close friend or a girlfriend or boyfriend, whatever, someone that you're close to, and you're going to show the track to them, and they're probably going to like it no matter what. And that just gives you a nice little ego boost. They might tell you they're honest feedback, but they might just try to make you feel good. 2, show it to someone who's not a close friend, preferably, that is a fan of the type of music that you make, because they can give you the perspective of a listener. They don't necessarily have the technical knowledge to say like, oh, that thing's too loud, or that thing's overcompressed, whatever, but they can be like, yeah, this song's great. Or they can be like, meh, I don't know why, but I didn't like it. And then step 3 is show it to someone who's a more experienced music producer than you are, preferably more experienced, they can be at your level or whatever. The reason for this is you want someone to be able to give you like detailed technical feedback. You know, your mix isn't compressed enough. You have too much 4K frequency content. It really hurts to listen to. This mix won't sound good in a car for this reason, or, you know, whatever. But that gives you 3 different perspectives, and it's very important. And the most important thing when getting feedback is you don't want to be defensive. You want to, you know, listen to the feedback, thank them for giving it to you, accept it, and use it to make yourself better. So that's not all. I have a video right here that I think you should watch, and this video in the bottom is what YouTube thinks you should watch. If you got anything out of this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing and ringing the bell to stay updated, because I do upload videos every single Tuesday and Friday. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks. Bye.